How would you feel if everything you believe about the people you trusted the most, about your family, is suddenly thrown into question? How would you react if you found out that the ones you trusted the most had been living a double life, keeping secrets so dark that they ultimately led to tragedy? Here's where it gets even more unsettling. Imagine you're a man who has dedicated his life to serving justice, a sheriff no less. Your entire world revolves around truth, law, and order. You believe in protecting your community and upholding the values of honesty and trust. But what happens when the very fabric of your own family, the people you love and live with, is ripped apart by lies so deep you can barely recognize the life you've been living? Now consider this: a simple DNA test, something as routine as helping with a community initiative, opens Pandora's box. A family secret, so well hidden, so well disguised, comes crashing into the light. A discovery that completely shatters your identity, your trust, your sense of reality. And once the truth is revealed, there's no going back. It's the kind of truth that doesn't just hurt. It destroys. It drives a man to do the unthinkable. You might be wondering what could be so devastating, so earth-shattering, that it would push someone to murder. How could a DNA test lead to not just one, but two brutal killings? What dark family secret could be so powerful that it drives a man, a sheriff, to take the lives of his own loved ones? These are the burning questions we're going to explore in today's story. And trust me, the answers will leave you stunned. You see, when we think about betrayal, we often imagine it as something external. A friend, a co-worker, maybe even a stranger. But what happens when the betrayal comes from within your own family, from the people who are supposed to love and protect you? What happens when the foundation of everything you've built is suddenly revealed to be a lie? How does someone come to grips with the realization that the children they've raised, the family they've cherished, aren't really theirs? The story we're about to unfold is unlike any other. It's a tale of love, lies, and betrayal so deep that it led to deadly consequences. It's a story that asks one of the most difficult questions. How far can betrayal push a person before they break? How much can a person take before the lines between right and wrong become blurred and vengeance takes over? As we unravel this case, you'll see how one small, seemingly harmless decision, a DNA test, sets off a chain of events that no one could have anticipated. It will take us into the heart of a family torn apart, a small town shaken to its core, and a sheriff who once stood as the pillar of justice, but ended up becoming the very thing he fought against. This story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about family, loyalty, and the power of secrets. It's not just about a murder. It's about how the truth, when it comes out, can destroy even the strongest of people. In just a moment, we're going to set the scene and introduce you to the key players in this tragic story. But before we do that, think about this. What would you do if you found out that your sibling, the person you grew up with, trusted, and loved, was not only betraying you behind your back, but was also responsible for fathering your children? Could you forgive such a betrayal, or would the rage consume you? As we dive deeper into this story, you'll come to understand the terrifying choices that led to two violent deaths. You'll see how a man who was once the beacon of law and order became a killer when faced with the ultimate betrayal. This isn't just a crime story, it's a psychological unraveling, a descent into madness driven by lies, and what you're about to hear is more than just a true crime case. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences of uncovering the truth when the truth is too unbearable to handle. Buckle up, because this story will take you on a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, and by the end, you'll be left wondering, could this happen to anyone? Could it happen to you? Stay with us as we begin our deep dive into the story of Sheriff Marcus Reed, a man whose life was turned upside down by a DNA test, and the murderous aftermath that followed. Our story begins in the quiet rural town of Lakewood, nestled deep in the southern countryside. It's the kind of place where time moves a little slower, where neighbors wave as they pass by, and where everyone knows your name and your business. It was a town where families put down roots, often staying for generations. The Reeds were one of those families. At the heart of Lakewood was a man whose presence was felt in every corner of the community, Sheriff Marcus Reed. In many ways, Marcus was the face of Lakewood, a man whose reputation for honesty and integrity preceded him. He wasn't just the sheriff. He was a husband, a father, and a neighbor, the kind of man who coached his kids' soccer games on Saturdays and took pride in grilling the perfect burgers at the annual town barbecue. He'd served as sheriff for nearly a decade, a role that had become second nature to him. The badge he wore wasn't just a symbol of authority. It represented his commitment to the town and to his family. And what a family it was. Marcus had a wife, Emily, whom he had been married to for over 15 years. Together, they had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. The Reeds were a fixture in the town's social fabric, often seen at church on Sundays or cheering from the sidelines at Little League games. From the outside looking in, the Reed family was perfect. Emily was the kind of woman people gravitated toward, warm, kind, and always ready to lend a helping hand. The kids were polite, well-mannered, and full of life. It was hard not to envy what the Reeds had, a picture-perfect life in a picture-perfect town. End quote. But, as we all know, things are rarely as they seem. In Lakewood, appearances were everything, but even in the most perfect of images, there can be cracks hidden just beneath the surface. And in the Reed family, there was a secret that had been buried for years, hidden in plain sight. No one could have imagined just how deep those cracks went, not even Marcus. In 2021, Lakewood introduced a new initiative aimed at solving cold cases. It was a voluntary DNA program meant to build a genetic database that could help with solving past crimes or identifying missing persons. It was a community effort, one that many residents saw as a positive step toward justice and closure for families who had long been searching for answers. And Marcus, being the town's sheriff, was more than happy to lead the way. Always a man of action, he rallied his family to participate, thinking of it as nothing more than a routine part of his role in the community. It was a simple thing, just a few swabs, a couple of forms, and off the samples went. For Marcus, it was just another day on the job, another way to demonstrate his commitment to the town he had sworn to protect. He had no reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. He had complete faith in the life he had built, in the family he had raised, and in the brother he had grown up with. After all, family was everything in Lakewood, and Marcus had always considered himself lucky to have a brother like Jake. Jake had been by Marcus's side through thick and thin. Even though Jake lived a bit more on the edge, a little more free-spirited than his older brother, Marcus always believed that family came first. They shared a bond that had only grown stronger since their parents passed away. But as the DNA results came back, something didn't add up. Marcus had never been one to jump to conclusions. He was a man who dealt in facts, who believed in finding the truth, no matter how long it took. But when he noticed the inconsistencies in the DNA results, something inside him stirred. At first, he chalked it up to a mistake. Maybe the lab had made an error. After all, these things happened, right? He was, after all, the father of these children. He had been there every step of the way. The births, the first words, the first steps. They were his, without question. But that nagging feeling, that tiny seed of doubt started to grow, and Marcus, being the lawman he was, couldn't leave it alone. He needed answers. So he began to dig. A little deeper, and then deeper still, and that's when the ground beneath him started to shift. The truth was more horrifying than anything Marcus could have ever imagined. As he reviewed the results over and over again, a gut-wrenching realization began to settle in. The DNA didn't lie. His children, his 3 beloved children, were not biologically his. They were fathered by someone else. And the identity of that person was a blow so devastating it left Marcus reeling. The DNA analysis pointed to his own brother, Jake. In that moment, Marcus's world, the life he had so carefully built, the family he had cherished, came crashing down around him. Every memory, every moment of joy he had shared with his children was suddenly tainted. The betrayal wasn't just from his wife, Emily. It was from his own flesh and blood. The brother he had trusted implicitly. The brother he had loved, protected, and stood by for years, Jake. The one person Marcus thought would never hurt him had crossed an unforgivable line. How long had this been going on? How deep did the betrayal run? Marcus had so many questions, but the answers he feared would be worse than the truth he had just uncovered. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of the deception. And then, like a dam breaking, everything that had once seemed solid, everything that had once been certain, began to dissolve. But the questions that burned the most were these. How could he not have seen it? How could he have been so blind? And now that the truth was out, what would he do next? The discovery was only the beginning. The real nightmare was just about to unfold. For what felt like hours, Marcus just stood in silence, replaying the moments of his life over and over in his head. How had he missed it? How had he been so blind? Every shared holiday, every family dinner, every time Jake had stopped by for a beer or to throw a ball around with the kids, had it all been a lie? How long had this been going on? Marcus couldn't escape the questions, and the answers terrified him. Jake had always been around. They were brothers, after all, and growing up, they had been inseparable. Thick as thieves, some would say. Jake was the carefree one, the one who lived life without a plan, the kind of person who drifted through life, while Marcus, ever the responsible one, took on the role of protector after their parents passed. Marcus had always kept an eye on Jake, bailing him out of trouble, giving him advice, and making sure he never strayed too far off the rails. But now, looking back, all those times Jake had been close to his family, had it been more than just brotherly love? Was there something more sinister at play? Marcus's thoughts raced. Jake had always been there for Sunday dinners, birthdays, holidays. He had always played the doting uncle, taking the kids fishing, teaching them how to ride bikes, giving them advice. But had all of that been a cover for something deeper? Had Jake been inserting himself into Marcus's family in ways he never could have imagined? The realization hit Marcus like a freight train. His brother hadn't just been close to his family, he had been too close, far too close. The affair between Jake and Emily hadn't been a one-time mistake. It had been going on for years, years of deception, of lies, of betrayal. And Marcus, the man who prided himself on his instincts, on his ability to read people, had been utterly blind to it all. The weight of the discovery pressed down on Marcus, suffocating him. His heart pounded in his chest, his breathing grew shallow, and the walls of his office seemed to close in around him. He needed answers, but more than that, he needed to confront the people who had betrayed him, the people he had loved more than anything in this world. First, he confronted Emily. He had waited until the children were out of the house, not wanting them to witness what he knew would be an explosive confrontation. The house, usually filled with the sounds of laughter and the chaos of family life, was eerily quiet as Marcus stood in the living room, waiting for Emily to come home. When she finally walked through the door, she could tell something was wrong immediately. The tension in the air was palpable, and the look on Marcus's face left no room for doubt. He knew. Without saying a word, Marcus handed her the DNA results. Emily's face went pale as she looked at the paper, her hands trembling as she realized the secret she had worked so hard to keep hidden had finally come to light. For a moment, there was silence. A thick, suffocating silence that hung between them like a storm waiting to break. Then Emily began to speak, her voice trembling as she tried to explain. She told Marcus that the affair had started before they were even married, that she had been confused, that she had feelings for both brothers. She said all the things someone says when they're trying to justify the unjustifiable. But nothing she said could ease the pain Marcus felt. Every word she spoke only deepened the wound, twisting the knife further into his heart. Marcus listened, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't hear her excuses over the roar of his own anger. Emily had betrayed him, lied to him, stolen the life he thought he had. And worse than that, she had done it with his own brother. But if Marcus thought Emily's betrayal was the worst of it, he was wrong. The real confrontation, the one that would forever change the course of his life, was yet to come. After confronting Emily, Marcus knew there was only one person left to face: Jake. His brother. His flesh and blood, the person he had trusted more than anyone else in the world. The drive to Jake's house felt like a lifetime. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. His mind raced with thoughts of what he would say, how he would confront the man who had shattered his world. When he arrived, Jake was sitting on the porch, sipping a beer like it was any other day. The sight of him, so casual, so relaxed, made Marcus's blood boil. He stormed up the porch steps, his heart pounding in his chest, the anger he had been holding back finally bubbling to the surface. Without warning, Marcus threw the DNA results onto the table in front of Jake. There was no need for words. The look in Marcus's eyes said it all. Jake glanced at the paper, then back at Marcus. For a moment there was silence, and then Jake, with that same infuriating smirk that had always gotten him into trouble, shrugged. "Look, man," Jake said, leaning back in his chair. "It just happened. I didn't mean for things to go this far." Those words, the casual, dismissive way Jake said them, sent Marcus over the edge. His entire world had been destroyed, and here was Jake, acting as if it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt Marcus. It was the complete lack of remorse. The way Jake seemed to brush it off, as if it didn't matter. Marcus's vision blurred with rage as he lunged at Jake, grabbing him by the collar. Years of pent-up frustration, anger and hurt came pouring out as Marcus shouted at his brother, demanding to know why. Why had Jake done this? Why had he betrayed the one person who had always been there for him? But Jake, true to form, didn't offer any real answers. He simply looked away, as if the whole thing was beneath him. That moment, that smirk, that callousness, it broke something inside Marcus. His whole life he had prided himself on being the level-headed one, the calm, rational brother. But now, standing there, staring into the face of the man who had taken everything from him, Marcus felt something shift. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was about years of deception, years of living a lie. Jake had crossed a line, and Marcus knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The confrontation ended without violence, but the damage had been done. Marcus walked away from his brother that day, but the weight of the betrayal followed him. He couldn't escape it. Everywhere he looked, he was reminded of the life he thought he had, the family he thought was his. And as the days passed, the anger inside him only grew, because the real nightmare was still to come. The days that followed the confrontation with Jake were like an unrelenting storm inside Marcus's mind. He tried to carry on as usual, patrolling the streets of Lakewood, maintaining the calm facade of the town's trusted sheriff. But behind the surface, something had broken. The betrayal, the lies, the humiliation, it gnawed at him, festering in his thoughts. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jake's smirk, that shrug of indifference, as if the years of deceit had been nothing more than a careless mistake. Marcus began to withdraw from the world around him. His once perfect family life felt like a cruel joke, a play in which he had been the only one unaware of the script. His children, innocent in all of this, looked up at him with adoration, and it tore him apart knowing they weren't his, they were Jake's. It was a thought he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. Every time one of them called him Dad, it was like a knife twisting deeper into his chest. Emily, sensing the shift in Marcus, tried to keep things normal, but the tension in the house was unbearable. She was walking on eggshells around him, terrified of what he might do next. She had confessed everything, thinking that maybe they could somehow move forward, but she didn't understand the depth of Marcus's pain. To her, it was a terrible mistake, something they could eventually work through. But to Marcus, it was the end of everything he had ever known. The resentment toward Jake consumed Marcus. It wasn't just the affair, it was the years of deception, the way Jake had inserted himself into every aspect of Marcus's life. Every memory Marcus had, his wedding day, the birth of his children, family vacations, was now tainted by the knowledge that Jake had been lurking in the background, hiding his betrayal behind a mask of brotherly affection. And that smirk, that infuriating, dismissive smirk, haunted Marcus day and night. The anger built up like a pressure cooker, and soon, Marcus found himself driving to Jake's house again. This time there was no plan, no thought of talking things through. As he pulled into the driveway, his heart pounded in his chest, and his mind was clouded with rage. He walked up to the door, fists clenched, ready for whatever confrontation might come next. When Jake opened the door, the same carefree expression was plastered on his face, as though nothing had changed. He acted like the affair was a mistake of the past, something they could put behind them. But Marcus knew better. He saw the casual disdain in Jake's eyes, the arrogance that came from getting away with the ultimate betrayal for so long. And that's when something inside Marcus snapped. The argument escalated quickly. What began as harsh words turned into shouting, the years of anger and pain spilling out like a dam breaking. Marcus demanded answers, demanded to know how Jake could live with himself after what he had done. But Jake, ever the reckless, unrepentant brother, continued to brush it off. He laughed, even, telling Marcus to calm down, to stop being so dramatic. That laugh, it was the last thing Marcus remembered, before everything went black. In a blind rage, Marcus grabbed a nearby object, a heavy ceramic vase, and swung it at Jake's head. The impact was sickening, the sound of the vase shattering, followed by the dull thud of Jake's body hitting the floor. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Marcus stood there, breathing heavily, staring down at his brother's crumpled body. Blood began to pool around Jake's head, but Marcus couldn't move. His mind was racing, his heart pounding, but his body felt numb. What had he just done? Jake lay there, unconscious, his chest barely rising and falling with shallow breaths, and for a brief moment, Marcus considered calling for help. He could stop this. He could save his brother, and maybe, just maybe, they could still come out of this with some shred of their old lives intact. But then, the memories of the betrayal flooded back. The affair, the lies, the children, all those years of living a lie, all those moments Jake had stolen from him. And in that moment, Marcus made a decision that would seal his fate. With cold, deliberate action, Marcus knelt beside Jake. His hands, once so steady from years of upholding the law, now trembled as he reached out. He placed his hands around Jake's throat, his grip tightening as the anger consumed him once more. Jake's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, but it was too late. Marcus squeezed harder, his mind going blank as he watched the life drain from his brother's body. When it was over, Marcus stood up, staring down at what he had done. His own brother, the person he had loved and protected for years, was gone. And he had done it. He had crossed the line, the point of no return. The drive back home felt surreal. His mind was in a fog, his emotions numb. But when he pulled into the driveway, a new wave of fury washed over him. Emily was inside, the woman who had betrayed him just as deeply as Jake had, and in his twisted, rage-filled mind, Marcus began to convince himself that she was just as guilty. She had lied to him for years, raised children that weren't his, all while playing the role of the perfect wife. When he walked through the front door, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, her face pale with worry. She had seen the look in Marcus's eyes before, cold, distant, filled with something she didn't recognize. She stood up, her voice trembling as she asked where he had been, but Marcus didn't answer. Instead, he reached into the drawer where he kept his service revolver. The weight of the gun in his hand felt different this time, heavier, like the weight of all the years of betrayal and anger he had been carrying. Emily's eyes widened in fear as she realized what was happening. She begged for him to stop, pleaded for him to put the gun down, to think of the children, but Marcus wasn't thinking anymore. His mind was clouded with rage, and the only thing he could see was the betrayal that had destroyed his life. In a single, cold motion, Marcus raised the gun and fired. The sound echoed through the house, a sound that would forever haunt the once peaceful walls of their home. Emily crumpled to the floor, her life taken in the same brutal manner as Jake's. Marcus stood there, staring at her body, the gravity of what he had done slowly sinking in. The home that had once been filled with laughter and love was now drenched in blood, a symbol of everything he had lost. But Marcus didn't feel remorse. Not yet. Instead, he felt an eerie sense of calm. The people who had betrayed him were gone, and for a brief moment, he thought the nightmare was over. But he was wrong, because the real consequences were yet to come. The aftermath of that fateful night sent shockwaves through the quiet town of Lakewood. The murder of Jake and Emily Reed was a crime that no one could have ever predicted, especially from someone as respected as Sheriff Marcus Reed. The community that had once relied on him for protection and justice was now left to grapple with the horrifying reality that their lawman had become a cold-blooded killer. As the investigation unfolded, the shocking details began to emerge. The discovery of the affair between Marcus's wife, Emily, and his brother, Jake, was only the beginning of the unraveling. It was revealed that Marcus had suspected something was wrong long before the DNA test confirmed his worst fear. But nothing could have prepared him for the truth. His anger, his heartbreak, had driven him to an irreversible breaking point, and on that night he had taken matters into his own hands. Marcus's actions were now the subject of intense scrutiny. The town's once heroic sheriff had gone from protector to murderer in a matter of hours. News outlets from all over the country picked up the story, and soon the tragedy of Lakewood became national news. Everyone wanted to understand how a man so well respected could fall so far. Was this the breaking point of a man pushed to his limits, or was it the unraveling of a dark side that had always been there, hidden beneath the surface? For Marcus, the consequences were swift and unavoidable. His colleagues, some of whom had been his closest friends, were now tasked with investigating the man they had worked alongside for years. They were forced to confront the undeniable truth that the sheriff they had trusted had committed 2 murders in cold blood. He was no longer a symbol of justice. He was a symbol of the devastating power of betrayal. But as the investigation continued, something strange happened. Marcus had already been arrested and was awaiting trial, but his demeanor in the days following his capture was far from remorseful. In fact, he seemed almost detached from the gravity of what he had done. He never once expressed guilt for killing Jake or Emily. Instead, he explained his actions in a cold, almost emotionless manner. He spoke of how his life had been destroyed by those he trusted most, how his love for his children had been shattered by the realization that they weren't even his. It was clear that Marcus's sense of justice had been replaced by an overwhelming thirst for vengeance. But the real tragedy wasn't just Marcus's fall from grace. It was the children. The 3 kids who had once called Marcus dad were now left without both of their parents. They were torn between the father who had raised them and the man who was their biological father, a man they would now only know as a criminal. Their lives had been shattered, their innocence lost, and they were left to try to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. In the trial that followed, Marcus's defense team tried to argue that his actions were the result of temporary insanity, brought on by the years of emotional turmoil and betrayal. They painted a picture of a man pushed to the edge by his own flesh and blood, but the prosecution was adamant. Marcus Reed was a cold-blooded killer who had taken the law into his own hands, and he would have to pay the price for his crimes. When the verdict came down, the courtroom was filled with tension. Marcus was convicted of 2 counts of murder, but the judge would later recommend a reduced sentence due to his apparent mental state at the time of the killings. It was a controversial decision, one that sparked debate throughout the nation. Could a man who had been wronged so deeply ever be forgiven for taking the lives of those who had wronged him? Was there ever any justification for what he had done? As Marcus served his time, he was left to reflect on the life he had destroyed, not only his own, but the lives of everyone who had been touched by his actions. He had gone from a respected sheriff to a criminal who could never escape the consequences of his choices. The people of Lakewood would never forget the nightmare that had descended upon their town, and they would forever question the true nature of the man who had once stood for everything they believed in. But as the years passed, the story of Marcus Reed began to fade from the headlines. The small town of Lakewood slowly returned to its quiet, peaceful ways, but the scars of that tragedy remained, and the questions lingered. Was Marcus a victim of his circumstances, a man whose life had been ruined by those he loved most? Or was he simply a man who had let his own demons consume him, leading him down a path of destruction from which there was no return? As we reflect on this case, one thing is clear. Betrayal, no matter where it comes from, can have devastating consequences. And in this case, it wasn't just the people involved who paid the price. It was an entire community left to pick up the pieces of a shattered world. So, what do you think? Was Marcus justified in his actions, given the pain and betrayal he endured? Or was this a case of a man losing control, unable to cope with the weight of his own emotions? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that betrayal can lead to unspeakable consequences, don't forget to hit that subscribe button.